August 31, 1943. The Pacific lay like hammered tin beneath overcast, and the new Essex-class carrier shouldered into the wind with a confidence that felt almost arrogant. On her flight deck, men in yellow shirts danced their urgent semaphore, and the first of the new fighters taxied to the catapult. It looked familiar at a glance, naval, stout, purposeful, but there was more shoulder to the fuselage, more jaw to the cowling, the posture of a boxer who had found his weight. F-6 F, someone mouthed at the rail, the syllables still novel in a fleet that had learned its trade in Wildcats. The ordnance crews had already learned a new ritual: 6.50 caliber Brownings, 3 to a wing, belts mixed with armor-piercing incendiary and tracers, deep magazines laid in long, gleaming loops, fuel tanks self-sealing and thick with rubber, armor glass that threw back the morning glare like a shield. Launched into the grey, the first Hellcats climbed toward Marcus, Island Minami Torishima, to the men who held it a speck of coral and concrete that had watched the ocean for 2 years without challenge. The new fighters came up steady, not nimble exactly, but sure, the R-2800 behind the firewall, building a bass note that settled into ribs and instruments alike. Pilots who had sweated in Wildcats felt the difference in their shoulders. The throttle had more in it. The climb did not taper off and wheeze at altitude. The cockpit sat high with a view that made the sea feel far beneath, and the horizon like a thing one might drag closer. The first interceptors rose from Marcus in clean formations, the A6M0s that had taught the Pacific to respect turn and lightness. Diaries found after the war would describe the American intruders with a small, brittle humor. Fat fighters, heavy and slow, the kind one could draw into a level circle and carve apart with patience. In the first merge, some of that old doctrine held. Down low and slow, the Zero still rolled like a fish and turned inside anything that tried to follow the same circle. But the Hellcat pilots were already whispering to one another in the radio discipline learned from the men who had invented the weave over Midway. Do not turn. Climb. Keep the fight vertical. Use speed as a weapon rather than as a comfort. They came in with height and left with it, stooping like hawks. The throttle took a fistful and gave back more than any Wildcat had promised. The supercharger hauled at thin air as if it were rope. When the 6 guns spoke together, the sound was not a chatter but a chord, a mechanical organ note that stitched white impacts across aluminum and fabric. In one early pass above Marcus, a section leader watched his tracers walk along a Zero's wing route and then vanish inside the fuselage. The Japanese fighter seemed to pause before the canopy blew forward, and the aircraft rolled onto its back and separated into pieces. He felt it as surprise before, he felt it as victory. The magazines still held, the guns had not jammed. He had been at the trigger for seconds, and still had long seconds left if he needed them. It was a new arithmetic sustained fire instead of husbanded cannon shells, and the realization ran through the ready rooms that night like current. The Essex returned to the wind, recovered her aircraft, and steamed east with the ocean closing neat and indifferent behind her wake. On the mess decks, pilots traded short sentences that meant more than they said. She climbs. The sight picture is clean. The cockpit is a room, not a coffin. Men who had watched tracers walk into Wildcat fuel tanks and blossom into heat found themselves patting armor plate as one pats a good horse. The phrase Grumman Iron Works began as a joke and became a benediction. The racks under the wings invited bombs without complaint. The undercarriage took the deck with a sailor's grace. The engines did not cough like old men at height. They pulled. October came, and with it Wake Island, and the new fighters returned with a harder jaw. The carriers moved like a floating city, Essex alongside her sisters, decks crowded with blue-grey machines whose spines folded so more could be stowed. The American carriers were not just ships, they were factories of sorties, workshops of maintenance, schools of tactics. Gunnery officers unspooled gun camera film in darkened compartments, rewinding and pointing with pencils, marking the places where tracers ran high and low, where the lead was short, where the burst was too brief for physics to oblige. The Thach-weave that had kept Wildcats alive became a base layer rather than a gospel. With the Hellcat, the weave could be used to bait, to create angles, to build energy and keep it, then to break and climb into the sun and roll back down with 6 guns humming. Japanese pilots came out again at wake, slower to scramble now, the burden of 2 years in their logbooks and too few hours in the logbooks of the men next to them. Post-war interrogations would set the numbers down without drama. Fewer flight hours before combat, fewer instructors, a training pipeline frayed by fuel that never arrived. Yet courage came at them at the same speed as before. 1-0 tried to draw a Hellcat into the old dance, rolling off the top and flattening, baiting the American into a level circle where the light fighter would clip away distance like a knife shaving bark. The Hellcat pilot kept the nose a hair below the horizon, felt the weight grow into speed, and went up instead, a quarter loop into clean sky. The 0 followed at first, then fell back, then fell away. The Hellcat rolled, showed belly and guns, and came back down as if the ocean had tilted toward the island. 2 seconds on the trigger put a seam of sparks along the Japanese fighter's spine. The American did not stay to admire his work. He was already moving through altitude for the next pass, already speaking a small prayer of thanks to a supercharger that made thin air feel thick. In the ready rooms, somebody chalked on the board a simple catechism. Do not turn where he is strongest. Make him turn where he is weakest. Keep your speed, keep your height, re-attack. They drew circles and arrows and wrote numbers that engineers would understand, and pilots would feel the rate of climb at 20,000 feet, the dive acceleration from 25, at the time to 1/4 turn at 200 knots versus 150, and they made a grammar of it, the way sailors have always made grammar out of wind. The Hellcat's grammar had clauses the Wildcat did not. Armor bought another chance. Self-sealing tanks turned what would have been funeral smoke into a brown stain and a startled curse. The canopy showed the world without bars across it. The rudder held authority in the dive. The engine gave the pilot a veto. And still, the pilots reminded themselves, the 0 was no ghost to be swatted. It could still turn inside you and bite your flank if you forgot your own rules. An officer from the gunnery department held up a strip of film, showing a Hellcat trying the old European reflex, hauling hard to keep the enemy in the windscreen, and losing the picture as the 0 slid across the nose, and then through the blind spot. The officer stopped the film with his thumb and spoke a sentence that would end up in pocket notebooks and painted in small letters on the back of kneeboards. Fly your airplane, not his. The carrier context mattered as much as the dogfights. Essex-class decks multiplied across the map like new islands, and each carried not only aircraft but the mechanics to keep them in the air, the spares to make engines new again, the manuals that made complicated things simple enough to do at 2 a.m, deep magazines, not just in wings but in storerooms, ammunition by the ton, fuel in tanks that made a ship a lung-breathing, avgas, food and parts and canvas and coffee and spare propeller blades stacked in labelled bins. The enemy still flew from garrison islands, from fields hacked into jungle and coral, and every destroyed hangar was a day, 2 days, a week, carved from their sortie rate. The American carriers could steam beyond the horizon and return with more airplanes than they had left with. On the wake of wake, after the last strafing run had drawn black smoke into the sky and the last bomb-cratered runway had been crossed off the day's objectives, the pilots sat beneath quiet fans and wrote in their notebooks. They wrote the details that would keep friends alive, at what altitude the 0's climb seemed to sag, at what speed the Hellcat's ailerons began to feel heavy, how long a burst one could hold before the tracers climbed off the sight picture. They wrote the small poetry of survival in a tone that pretended it was prose. And later, in offices far from salt and sun, Japanese officers would write in their own calm hands about that same day, the new American fighter with its 6 guns that never seemed to run out of cartridges, the way it would not stay to play the old games, the way it always seemed to have another climb in it, another dive, another chance. By the end of October, the word had travelled in both languages. The fat fighter was not slow. The heavy fighter was not clumsy. It did not outroll a zero down low, and it did not need to. It brought altitude like a weapon, speed like a hammer, armor like a second heartbeat, and magazines so deep that a pilot could afford to be patient and still be deadly. On Essex-class decks, the new breed taxied with the casual power of something that knows its purpose and has found its war. The first sightings were done. The misjudgments had had their day. The Hellcat had arrived, and the sky around it was beginning to change. The Central Pacific woke to a new rhythm in November 1943. The Gilbert Islands, Tarawa foremost, became a crucible where doctrine turned to muscle memory, and every pilot learned what the F-6 F truly was, not a naval fighter that could also fight a war, but a naval weapon built expressly to dominate one. On the carriers fanning out from Pearl, Hellcats sat wing-folded like crouched beasts, blue-grey hides taut under dew and salt. It was there, in ready rooms thick with cigarette haze and chalk dust, that young aviators heard a new mantra: speed first, then angles, never the other way around. Tarawa's lagoon was as blue as heaven and as red as hell by the end of the first day's fighting, but above the carnage the work was clean and cold. Hellcats escorted Dauntlesses and Avengers, stacked high and restless, waiting to pounce. When Japanese fighters came a dwindling but still determined cadre of Zero pilots from the Marshalls, the Americans finally fought with clarity born from blood and film. At 17,000 feet over Betio, Lieutenant Gus Widhelm spotted the sunglint of approaching Zeros. The old instinct tugged at his stick: turn first, defend your section, but the Hellcats' manuals, and the Wildcats' ghosts, whispered otherwise. He pushed the nose slightly down, let the R-2800 spool, and dragged the fight upward. The Zero that followed managed half the climb before its engine note changed, thin and strained. Widhelm rolled inverted and came back like a dropped hammer. His burst lasted less than a second, just 3 heartbeats, but 50 caliber rounds, stitched from spinner to cockpit. The Japanese fighter came apart like wet paper. Back aboard ship that evening, the mechanics lifted the cowlings on battle-scarred Hellcats and shook their heads at punctured skin and untouched engines. Pilots ran fingers across armor plates, warm from the day's sun and colder from the day's mercy. The lesson was etched by hands still trembling from adrenaline. Altitude was life, armor was grace, speed was a vow. Far to the south, in the Solomons, the same truth ripened in different air. Carrier Hellcats worked alongside land-based squadrons at Henderson Field, where coral dust coated boots and engines and men. They flew against the same enemy who had dueled Wildcats in 1942, but now the tables had turned. Flight hours favored the Americans, replacements arrived by convoy instead of canoe, and Hellcats sat ready with panel latches tight and oxygen masks hanging like idle threats. Japanese diaries from Rabaul told of astonishment. The new American fighter climbed like a rising mountain and dove, as if falling from heaven with its tail on fire. A surviving Zero ace would later testify that the Hellcat's dive was beyond pursuit. No discipline, no courage, no prayer could force a Zero to follow that plunge and live. It was the tactical equivalent of breathing underwater while your opponent drowned in air. When the Essex-class carriers joined Enterprise near the Marshalls in January 1944, the U.S. Navy became something no fleet had ever been, a mobile empire of air. Combat air patrols ringed each task force, layered like armor plates, Hellcats above, Hellcats mid, Hellcats roving out beyond radar range. Pilots joked, dry-mouthed, that they were the best advertisement for buy more Grummans. The joke stuck because it was true. Naval intelligence tallied aircraft on both sides, and the math was final. America could place more Hellcats in the air in 1 month than Japan could train pilots in 3. In one briefing aboard USS Bunker Hill, an instructor pointed at the chalkboard silhouette of a Zero and then at a Hellcat drawn beside it, blocky and unashamed. He turns war into fencing. We turn war into physics. You have horsepower. Spend it. The men nodded, not in bravado but in belief, earned over Tarawa and the Gilberts. They had seen Zero wings fold like gull feathers under machine gun fire. They had watched Hellcats land with holes one could put a fist through, and still taxi to parking. By the first days of 1944, the laughter that had greeted the large American fighter in Japanese wardrooms was gone. In its place grew a quiet calculation, grim, heavy, honest. The Zero's days as master of the Pacific were over, and every pilot who looked up from a coral runway or steel flight deck understood why. The Hellcat had not merely entered the war, it had brought a new grammar of air combat. Speed was sentence, altitude punctuation, 6 guns the final full stop, and above the endless Pacific, the cat sharpened its claws for the next island, the next sky. Rabaul did not fall in a storm of Marines, it drowned beneath a tide of airplanes, and at the crest of that tide, thick-chested and steel-jawed, came the F-6 F Hellcat. In February 1944, the Japanese fortress, once the most fearsome bastion in the South Pacific, watched the horizon turn busy with American carriers. Essex, Bunker Hill, Enterprise, Yorktown, Lexington, names painted across iron decks, decks packed wing to wing with blue cats waiting to be loosed. Their pilots had heard the stories. Rabaul was flying death, an airfield complex cut into jungle and mountain, home to the best pilots who had survived Guadalcanal and the Solomons. To challenge Rabaul was to challenge the last concentrated reservoir of Japanese air mastery. The Hellcats launched before dawn, radials booming like distant thunder. Climbing through warm tropical haze, pilots saw the sun break over a volcano-ringed lagoon. Below lay the scar of runways and revetments, the jagged geometry of flak pits, the white threads of roads leading into the jungle like nerves. The Japanese came to meet them hundreds, not desperate yet, still proud. Zeros and Gecko night fighters, Val dive bombers pressed into interception duty, and a scattering of the new Ki-61 Tonys from army squadrons sent south in haste. They climbed into a sky already humming with Hellcats and coped, found themselves facing not a duel but an oncoming wall. Above 20,000 feet, the Hellcat owned the air. Its Pratt and Whitney pulled strong in thin oxygen, turbocharger rasping like a wolf's breath. Pilots slid throttles forward, felt the nose rise, and watched the altimeter spin like a clock in fast motion. They arrived with an altitude edge and kept it, turning the fight into sculpture-curved dives, clean zoom climbs, brief bursts of fire that ended lives in fractions of heartbeats. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu led one of the early sweeps. His section rolled over Rabaul's harbour, caught a formation of dive bombers forming up, and fell on them in disciplined fury. 3 seconds of trigger time, 3 aircraft gone. He climbed, rolled, dove again. A Japanese gunner, desperate and brave, raked his fuselage with tracers. The Hellcat shrugged it off like rain. Vrasiu returned to the deck of USS Intrepid grinning, holes stitched in his wing, paint scorched, but engine humming, contentedly. The crew chief's verdict was brief. Fly again tomorrow. Meanwhile, in Rabaul's ready huts, Japanese pilots bent over maps and whispered the new dread. Their diaries would later confess it plainly. We cannot draw them down anymore. The Zero's genius had been to pull opponents into the horizontal, into the slow dance, where wings whispered and rudders twitched like fishtails. But the Hellcat would not be charmed. It entered the fight like a hammer thrown from the sun, struck once and soared away. To follow was suicide. To flee invited 50 caliber punctuation. On February 21st, the garrison attempted a mass sortie, one last effort to break the siege from the sky. Over 100 Japanese aircraft climbed, the air shimmering with prop wash and hope. They reached ambush altitude to find Hellcats already waiting, stacked like iron-feathered hawks. What followed was not a battle but a harvest. Gun camera film would later show Zeros dissolving under converging streams of fire, wings folding, noses shearing, cockpits shredding. A single Hellcat ran out of ammunition after downing 4 planes. It returned to the carrier with guns smoking, engine smooth, pilot silent. Below, ship gunners watched with jaws clenched as blossoms of flame opened above the harbour. Looked like fireworks over Coney Island, one sailor wrote, except every spark was a dying airplane. Within weeks, the sky over Rabaul grew empty. The once proud fighter base was now a trap. Japanese commanders grounded. What remained there was no fuel, no hope, and too few pilots left to spend. Rabaul had become a museum of aircraft that could not rise. American intelligence officers, sifting captured diaries months later, found a sentence underlined twice. The new American fighter is invincible at height. We cannot reach it. We cannot flee it. It dives like a falling star and rises like a shooting one. By March 1944, the garrison understood. The Hellcat was not a challenger. It was a verdict. Rabaul's airfields lay littered with stripped husks, revetments quiet as tombs. Above them, every day, Hellcats patrolled not hunting, but confirming. The Zero had once been emperor of the Pacific sky. Over Rabaul, the crown slipped, fell, and was ground into dust by iron paws. Dawn, June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea lay calm, deceptively innocent, like a silk sheet waiting to be torn. Carrier Task Force 58 steamed west in a formation so broad it seemed a nation afloat. 15 fast carriers, each stacked with Hellcats, Avengers and dive bombers, screened by battleships, cruisers and destroyers forming concentric rings of steel. Above them, combat air patrols wove patient patterns, the blue silhouettes of F-6 F Hellcats flicking through the pale sky like sentinels. Below that sky, the Japanese combined fleet advanced last, largest throw of the imperial dice. They had named it with tragic grandeur, Operation Ago, the decisive battle they had promised since Pearl Harbor. They sailed with pride still in their hearts and faith in the Zero in their blood. But the pilots now strapping in across the water were not the men of 1941. They came with barely 50 flight hours, little gunnery practice, and maps that traced the bravado of past glories rather than the reality of a cornered empire. On the American decks, Hellcat pilots tightened harnesses and flexed gloved hands. They had seen what the enemy had become: fewer aces, more boys, courage undimmed but skill frayed thin by scarcity. And above all, they understood their own machine now, a predator whose strength lay not in nimble beauty but in speed, toughness, vision, and 6 throats of fire. Radar made the first call distant ghosts blooming on green glass. Raid bearing west-northwest, 150 miles. The command crackled across the fleet. The Hellcats, already aloft, came wheeling inward. More scrambled, wings clipped by sunlight as they lifted into formation. The sky thickened with American fighters. Pilots spoke in clipped tones, calm, controlled, too experienced now for swagger. Then the raids came. The first Japanese strike, 160 aircraft, broke into view as dots in the haze. They expected scattered American patrols, confused interceptors, maybe Wildcats. Instead, they met wall after wall of Hellcats' 3-section teams diving from above, section leaders crisp and ruthless, wingmen disciplined shadows. Lieutenant Commander Dave McCampbell, calm as a surgeon, keyed his mic. Fighters, easy, easy. Now, Hellcats dropped from altitude like guillotines. The opening clash was a lesson written in tracers and wreckage. A Zero tried to twist into a turning fight. A Hellcat ignored the bait, climbed through the vertical, rolled, and came down with its nose set like a spear. The Zero exploded in orange petals. A D-4Y Judy dive bomber attempted to dive away. 50 caliber rounds ripped into its spine and fuel tanks, shredding aluminum and bone. A veteran Japanese pilot who had survived Guadalcanal later said the American fighters appeared as if the sky itself had grown claws. Within minutes, the radio filled with stunned voices. Splash 1. Scratch 2 more. They just keep coming. American gunners aboard ships below watched the fight like spectators at a terrible celestial theatre. In the first wave alone, more than 70 enemy planes fell into the sea like burning hawks, most never reaching the fleet. The Hellcats lost only a handful, many pilots punching out and being plucked from the ocean minutes later by waiting submarines or destroyers. The contrast was brutal. The Pacific did not return Japanese pilots. More raids came, 4 in all, and 4 times the Hellcats rose to greet them. By dusk, the sky smelled of cordite and salt and burnt metal. Sea spray hissed against hulls. Somewhere, a pilot drifted in a life raft and heard explosions still echoing from distant battleships finishing stragglers. A sailor aboard USS Bunker Hill wrote in his diary that evening, "It looked like the world's biggest turkey shoot, and the Hellcats ran the shooting booth." He did not yet know that newspapers would christen the day the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot, nor that pilots decades later would wince at the flippancy the enemy had fought fiercely, even fatally, but the mismatch had become undeniable. By nightfall, the tally formed into myth: more than 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in one day. An air arm, the pride of Japan's empire, had shattered against iron discipline and blue-painted steel wings. Hellcats taxied back to decks streaked with hydraulic fluid and cordite dust. Some came home on one magneto, some with holes big as fists in their wings, one with half a rudder. But they came home. Their pilots walked past them, exhausted and young, helmets under arms, sweat, dried salt on their faces. Some laughed, some cried quietly. Most said nothing. They had seen the sky break today. In ready rooms, chalk scraped numbers, and even the most hardened aviators stared. One lieutenant whispered, "If this is not the end, it must be the beginning of the end." The war would rage on Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, but the Zero's kingdom had just collapsed. The Hellcat, born from desperation and tempered in coral airstrips and carrier decks, had become more than a fighter. It was a verdict. Japan had sent its wings into the furnace. The furnace had a name. Hellcat, the Sea off Leyte, October 1944, churned with history in the making. Dawn cracked over wave-tops like rifle fire, and the humid air already tasted of cordite and fate. America was coming back to the Philippines, and the mission was not merely military, it was a promise kept. But promises require sky control, and the sky now belonged to the Hellcat. On the decks of Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, Franklin, Hornet, and their sisters, Hellcats sat in solemn rows, cowlings still warm from night checks. Pilots drank thick coffee, strapped maps to thighs, and carried in pockets the last letters they'd never send unless the sea claimed them. They knew this campaign would be different. Japan had been bled of its best pilots, but desperation sharpens resolve. A cornered empire can be most dangerous in its final lunge. The first waves came fast: Zeros, Judy dive bombers, Betty bombers with torpedoes slung under bellies, Val remnants, and new types scarcely familiar even to Japanese mechanics. Many pilots had trained in a month, some in weeks. In another year, the Americans would have pitied them. Not today. The 1st Hellcat Division climbed into the rising sun, the R-2800 humming like a temple bell. The Japanese strike force, aiming for the landing fleet in Leyte Gulf, never got close. 10 minutes into the interception, the sky was a web of contrails and falling metal. A Hellcat rolled inverted above a Judy, fire flickering from the bomber's wing like a match guttering in wind. A Zero tried to climb too steeply, stalled, and hung helpless. A Hellcat pilot later wrote, "I saw his face. He looked terrified and 17. The Pacific had changed. The Zero's grace could not overcome steel and horsepower any longer. In the vertical, the Hellcat was a monarch. In the dive, a hammer. In the climb, a mountain rising. American fire discipline tightened short bursts, 1-second strings. There was no need to hold the trigger longer. 50 caliber bullets placed accurately were instruments of disassembly. October 25th, the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted across sea and sky. In the chaos north of Cape Engano, Hellcats faced what was left of the Imperial Navy's carrier air arm. Where once Japan had sent its sword, now it offered the scabbard. Carriers like Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, launched handfuls of Tarmskura, aircraft crewed by boys. Some aircraft took off from flight decks with mechanics still waving wrenches, shouting last-second instructions. Hellcats intercepted. They always did. In one sortie, a US pilot recorded the most haunting encounter of the campaign. A formation of Japanese trainers' biplanes pressed into suicide missions, their pilots solemn, resigned. The American aviators could scarcely believe it. "They came at us like ghosts," one Hellcat pilot said. "No anger, no fear, just duty." He shot them down anyway. Mercy in war is sometimes cruelty in disguise. Then came something new: aircraft that did not break off when hit, that did not evade, that did not fear falling. A pilot shouted on the radio, "This one's not pulling out." It struck the destroyer USS Smith in a plume of flame. A new word scorched itself into the Pacific lexicon. The Hellcat pilots watched in shock, then in grim resolve. The enemy had traded maneuver for martyrdom. Skill was no longer the deadliest weapon. Conviction wielded by the desperate was. From that day, Hellcat patrols flew lower, tighter, eyes straining for glints of sun on wings, watching not only for fighters but for falling comets of men determined to die. And still, they flew. And still, they intercepted. Through November and December, as American convoys snaked toward Leyte and Mindoro, Hellcats slashed down attackers in dozens a day. Over 150 Hellcat victories were claimed across the Philippines campaign. Pilots chalked kill tallies reluctantly. By this stage, the scoreboard felt less like triumph and more like accounting in a ledger of ruin. A Japanese combat diary later found near Manila held a line written in sorrow rather than anger. "We face the blue-winged ones again, armor on their hearts, armor on their machines. They climb like angels and strike like thunder. We cannot stop them, but we will die trying." By year's end, the Zero, the pride of 1941, was a relic, graceful as memory and just as mortal. The Hellcat had not simply beaten it, it had ended it. In the Philippines, the sky's crown passed completely. The last blade of Japanese air power broke not in a single dramatic duel, but in countless small moments when courage met inevitability. The Hellcat, scarred and salt-streaked, flew on. The empire beneath it frayed. The pilot wiped sweat from brow, and marked another day survived, another promise kept. The Pacific War thundered forward toward Iwo, toward Okinawa, toward a rising sun that would set at last. And in the carrier-ready rooms, men understood the truth, whispered between missions. The cat did not merely hunt. It endured, and endurance wins wars. The Pacific, in early 1945, had the sound of something immense breaking. Every map in every ready room bore the same circling arrow, now west, always west, the final tightening coil around the heart of the empire. But two stones still stood in the ocean like dark altar rocks, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And over each of them, the Hellcat would fight not only pilots, but ghosts, weather, flak, and desperation sharpened to a blade. Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. Sulphur stung the nostrils of every man on deck as the carriers approached an acrid cloud that hung over the island like a prophecy. Beneath it lay black sand, caves, and the stubborn fury of an enemy who understood that this ground was the last shield before their homeland. Above it flew Hellcats, circling like steel vultures over a battlefield that looked like a world being born and dying at the same time. The first Marines hit beaches that swallowed boots, shells, men. They signaled desperately for cover. Hellcats answered. They dove through smoke columns, twisting like black ropes, wings glinting silver as they broke sunlight. Rockets streaked into bunkers carved from volcanic rock. Machine gun bursts stitched ravines. The island shook, yet it did not yield. Japanese anti-aircraft fire snapped upward in angry, ragged arcs. Pilots spoke little on the radio. They didn't have to. They fought with the cold clarity of men who had seen 3 years of war and had no illusions left about mercy or myth. Somewhere in that sulphur haze, a Zero clawed upward, one of the last. The American pilot watching him climb felt almost a bitter respect. The Japanese machine shook, engine starving in thin air, but it came anyway. That was the tragedy now, not the Zero itself, but the hearts still strapped into them. The Hellcat pilot stayed high. He remembered his training. never give up gravity. When the Zero stalled, the Hellcat tipped its nose down like a hawk's beak, a 1-second burst. Fire blossomed. Wingtip to wingtip, the Zero flipped, trailing ash and resolve. It did not crash on land. It fell into the sea, returning to the endless graveyard that war had made of the Pacific. That day repeated itself 100 times. The Japanese air presence at Iwo didn't die in a blaze it thinned, like breath leaving a wounded chest. When the last fortified caves finally fell, the airfield scars below bore witness. Hellcats overhead, spent cartridges glittering on steel decks far at sea, air superiority so absolute it felt like gravity. Okinawa, April 1, 1945, last gate before Japan. Hellcats launched into skies already heavy with rumor of a new kind of attack, relentless and unbound by survival. And the rumors proved true. The kamikaze tide arrived not as madness but as method, hundreds at first, then thousands. They came low out of clouds, high from sun glare, and sometimes weaving sea-level paths between whitecaps. Pilots in Hellcats felt something unfamiliar, then grim dread, not of dying, but of watching others die if they failed to intercept. Combat air patrols now flew in iron cadence, 6 a.m. to noon. Noon to dusk, dawn again. Sleep came in ragged threads in canvas bunks that smelled of oil and salt and fear smothered into determination. The enemy no longer fought to turn the fight. They fought only to hit something before dying. Hellcats rose to meet them. A dive here, tracers stitching across wings before a kamikaze could find a target. A climbing intercept there, fuel gauges trembling, pilots whispering encouragement to engines as if they were living comrades. Some kamikazes broke apart in air, shaken by wind or panic or prayer. Some came screaming through like meteors of flesh and steel, and some hit. A pilot from USS Bunker Hill, who would later walk through the twisted wreckage of his ship, still smoking with over 300 sailors killed, wrote only one line that night. "We kill them because they leave us no other mercy." Above Okinawa, air combat became a paradox. The Hellcat, engineered to outfly, now fighting those who no longer intended to survive their own attack. It was not duel, it was defense, not chivalry, necessity. Hellcats fell, Zeros fell, but only one side had the sea to catch its pilots and ships to pull them home. By June, the flows of kamikazes slowed not because the tactic had failed tactically, but because it had annihilated the last trained aviators of the empire. The Japanese Air Service, once the terror of Pearl Harbor and Ceylon and the Coral Sea, was now a memory shredded by history and horsepower. After the storm, when Okinawa finally fell, the Hellcat pilots looked east across waters heavy with ghosts. They were tired, not triumphant, too many smoke plumes trailed behind them for triumph, but certain. The war in the air was decided. The next steps would be fought on islands and oceans and, perhaps, the very homeland that had birthed the Zero. In a quiet, ready room, one pilot, 22 years old, already grey at the temples from salt wind and sleepless nights, wrote, "The Zero taught us fear. The Hellcat taught us inevitability." The cat had clawed its way across the Pacific, island by island, sky by sky, until the only horizon left was Japan itself, and now, beyond Okinawa, the Empire had no air left to challenge the blue wings pacing the sky. The Hellcat did not roar. It did not need to. It simply remained aloft, proof that strength, discipline, and steel-forged endurance could outlast even the fiercest wind of war. Japan's summer of 1945 began not with sunrise, but with a long dusk, an empire breathing in shallow gasps. The war in the air was not merely ending, it had already ended, and only the echo of engines still marked the sky. Where once rising sun roundels circled in proud swarms, only the steady drone of American radials remained. And in that heavy quiet flew the Hellcat, unyielding, patient, merciless, in duty. The carriers moved northwest in procession, steel cathedrals crossing a darkening ocean. Deck crews worked shirtless in the heat, their skin burned the color of teak, while Hellcats squatted in rows, bomb racks slung with 1,000-pounders, and Pratt underwing rockets like steel arrows. The pilots who climbed into them this late in the war were not boys anymore. Their youth had been burned away somewhere between Tarawa, the Marianas, and Okinawa. They knew exactly what their machines could do, and what the enemy could no longer do. There were almost no interceptors left. On July 10th, when Task Force 38 struck the Japanese home islands, the few rising fighters looked ghostly, thin trails, engines coughing, pilots who had never seen combat and would never see another sunrise. A Hellcat section leader later said it felt like pushing down a door already off its hinges. Combat that day was not battle. It was burial performed at 300 knots. Hellcats swept over airfields around Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, hangars burned. Aircraft, some brand new, sat in neat rows like offerings on an altar, never flown, lacquer still shining. Pilots strafed, then strafed again, not from hatred but from the simple mathematics of war. Anything not destroyed today might kill someone tomorrow. One pilot found a cluster of trainer biplanes, fabric wings, no radios. He hesitated so long his wingman called him twice. He answered only, "Kids." Then he squeezed the trigger. War does not allow sentiment. Sentiment waits until afterward, when it feels like guilt. On July 24th, the Hellcats escorted bombers to Kure, where the Imperial Navy's pride once gleamed. Battleships lay half-sunk, hulls rust-striped, skeletal cranes looming like broken masts. Hellcats dove through flak that came in ragged spurts, as if the anti-aircraft crews themselves had lost heart. Ships that had launched dreams of empire now sat like gravestones in an oily harbour. A Japanese naval officer interrogated after the war would recall watching that attack. "Your fighters came low, not reckless but certain. We fired. It did not change anything. It only made the sky brighter." Hellcats worked in pairs and fours, diving on, dry docks, strafing warehouses, rocketing barges. The sound of their guns echoed across water that once hosted tea ceremony elegance aboard gleaming decks. Precision, routine, inevitability, every attack measured, crisp, almost surgical. Violence had become repetition. Yet in the chaos there was professionalism, even grim respect. Many pilots later admitted feeling something close to sorrow. They had grown up on legends of Pacific duels, of dogfights in clear sky, of pilots saluting before they fought. Now their enemies were shadows and smoke and training planes without ammunition. The war they had been promised had already died. They were finishing the corpse. The weather turned thick with humidity and exhaustion. The engines never complained. Hellcats launched daily, their pilots watching fuel gauges and horizon haze, striking transportation hubs, air depots, factories that had already ceased meaningful output. Japanese radios fell silent. Radar screens registered no fighters. Some Hellcat squadrons flew entire missions without seeing a single enemy aircraft. The worst danger was now the Pacific's uncanny moods, summer typhoons rolling like mountains across the sea. One storm forced half a carrier air group to divert to Iwo Jima. Their Hellcats landed lined with salt crust, pilots pale from fuel fumes and prayer. The fact that they lived, that they could live, was the last quiet triumph of the machine Grumman built. On August 6th, a single B-29 changed history at Hiroshima. On August 9th, another at Nagasaki. The Hellcats heard it by radio, not by sight. Some sat on carrier decks, helmets in hands, listening to the incomprehensible words, "Single bomb city destroyed." They had trained to fight fighters, bombers, fleets. None had imagined a world where war could vanish in a flash of light, and yet, even then, Hellcats flew. Patrols, recon, cover for minesweepers and occupation forces assembling like a tide. The war did not end in a single rise. A heartbeat for them. It faded, as wars really do, duty turning from fire to ember. August 15th, 1945. The radio crackled. Japanese surrender. Pilots stood in silence. Some cheered, some wept, some simply stared at the ocean that had carried them so long. A pilot from USS Yorktown wrote in his log that night, "We did not beat them in one battle, we beat them every day." The Hellcat had never been designed for glory, it had been built to win. And it did completely, methodically, relentlessly. The Empire had risen on wings of genius, it fell to wings of steel and discipline. Above the Pacific, in a final quiet patrol over a country too exhausted to resist, a Hellcat circled once more, not hunting, not fighting, simply bearing witness to a silence it had helped create. The plane Japan could not crack now flew over a sky Japan no longer controlled. And when the engine throttled back and the carrier deck caught its hook, the war in the air truly ended. Not with a dogfight, but with absence, with quiet, with a sky empty of challengers, the Hellcat rolled to a stop. The pilot shut down the engine, and for the first time in years, the Pacific breathed without fear. The war ended not with the dramatic landing of a last ace, nor with a final duel above a burning sea, but with engines shutting down one by one across the Pacific. Grey-blue aircraft came home and rested, their cowlings warm, their fuselages streaked with salt and soot. The Hellcat had been a weapon of necessity. Now it sat in silence as a generation tried to remember how to breathe in peace. On island strips from Guam to Ulithi, mechanics wiped oil from their hands and touched their aircraft as if unsure whether to let go. Deck crews leaned against arresting wires and watched the sea roll, no longer searching the horizon for smoke. Pilots walked across hangar decks, hearing only the hum of fluorescent lamps and the soft echo of boots. No alarms, no flight ops bells, no frantic scramble calls shrieking, "Launch fighters!" The sky had become quiet again, and in that quiet, truth emerged. The Hellcat, the machine Japanese pilots first mocked as slow and overweight, had finished the Pacific Air War with a kill-to-loss ratio that seemed almost mythic, 19-1. Historians would debate training, radar, logistics, tactics, attrition, and industrial weight. Pilots rarely bothered. They had seen what happened up close. They had watched the Zero's brilliance dissolve into fragility, its agility sacrificed against armor and speed and firepower that could not be outrolled or outturned away from. It was not a romantic victory. It was a system victory, industrial, doctrinal, psychological. The Hellcat had been the instrument, but the orchestra was America's arsenal, and the schools that trained pilots in formations, tactics, discipline, deflection shooting, and teamwork. The Zero had been born in a samurai dream, the Hellcat in a Long Island factory, governed by slide rules, production quotas, and practical engineering, and dreams rarely survive steel. In 1946, U.S. intelligence officers sat across from former Japanese air commanders in tatami rooms and makeshift interrogation chambers. The conversations were not bitter, they were heavy, respectful, haunted. Captain Saburo Shindo, once a proud officer of the Imperial Navy, whispered while staring at his hands, "When the Hellcat came, it was as if our fate arrived in a single airplane." Another pilot, once an ace over China, summarized the entire Pacific Air War in a single sentence. "At first we believed skill would decide. Later we learned industry decides skill." Young Japanese cadets, too late to fly in combat, studied American manuals and stared wide-eyed at surviving Hellcats on display in occupation fields. They noticed the armor around the cockpit, the thick self-sealing tanks, the metal ribbing inside the wings, the practicality in every bolt and panel. One student asked an American instructor, "Why did you build such a heavy fighter?" The American shrugged and answered without poetry, "So we wouldn't have to bury pilots." "No," Japanese pilot laughed then. Back home, the Hellcat didn't become a peacetime darling like the Mustang, nor a legend whispered by jet-age engineers like the Lightning. It didn't need to. It had done its work, and its pilots knew. On airfields across the United States, Hellcats were parked wingtip to wingtip, engines pickled, paint fading under sun and dust. Some were sold as surplus for a few $100s, others scrapped by cutting torches that hissed like angry snakes. A few lucky airframes went to museums. Metal plaques beneath them spoke politely, but veterans visiting those halls would pause, stare up at the plane, and talk softer than normal. They would touch a wing surface as if greeting an old friend. One Hellcat on display at NAS Pensacola drew notes from visitors who served with her model in the Marianas and Leyte. The messages were never dramatic, just quiet lines like, "You brought me home. We learned the sky together." For Joe, he deserved to land too. Sometimes a man would remove his hat and stand in silence, breathing shallowly, remembering tracer arcs and flak bursts and young faces gone before they ever learned what peacetime sounded like. In 1962, at a Pacific Aviation Symposium, former U.S. Navy and Japanese Navy pilots gathered many for the first time, not as enemies, but as old warriors sharing twilight. A Japanese officer, once a Zero instructor, bowed to a Hellcat pilot and said in halting English, "Your airplane? Very strong." The American smiled, shook his hand, and replied, "Your Zero taught us to build it." There was no bitterness, only a shared understanding that both nations had given everything to the sky, and the sky had taken what it demanded. History would crown louder heroes, sleeker silhouettes, faster jets. But the Hellcat sat unbothered by fame. It had never been beautiful by dueling circle standards. It did not whisper through clouds like a falcon. It arrived decisive, armored, steady, honest as a hammer. Its legacy was not mythic, daring, or cinematic glamour. Its legacy was victory earned by preparation, engineering discipline, pilot training, logistics, and steel-willed persistence. It was the story of a nation that learned bitter lessons in 1942 and returned in 1943 with a machine that answered every one of them. A journalist once asked a Hellcat veteran, "What made your plane great?" He thought long, then answered, "It forgave you." That is perhaps the greatest praise a fighter aircraft can receive, because wars are not won only by heroes, they are won by machines that bring ordinary men home alive. And so the Hellcat rests in hangars and museums, paint polished, wings folded like a tired predator finally at peace. It asks for nothing, it boasts of nothing. But in every bolt and rivet, one truth remains written in steel. It came when it was needed. It flew until the sky was safe. It left the world quieter than it found it. The plane Japan could not crack never roared in triumph. It simply stood guard until there was nothing left to guard against. And then, like its pilots, it went home.